Frank Holloway's daughter didn't cry when she found out he had bought the old post office. She got angry. Denise stood in his kitchen with the unsigned sale papers in one hand and the property tax notice in the other, staring at him like he had finally done something unforgivable. How could a 76-year-old retired mailman spend nearly everything he had left on a building with a leaking roof, rotted floors, boarded windows, and no business left inside it? "Dad," she said, her voice shaking, "Mom is gone. Your pension is not enough, and that place is not worth saving." Frank did not argue. He only looked past her, through the rain-speckled kitchen window, toward Main Street, where the small brick post office sat dark behind plywood and a rusted flagpole. Everyone in town thought he was clinging to old memories. The developer thought he was blocking progress. His daughter thought grief had finally made him reckless. But Frank knew something none of them did. Behind the old sorting wall, there was a locked room, and the last man who opened it never spoke about what he saw. If stories about forgotten people, old promises, and things the world was too quick to throw away mean something to you, consider subscribing, because what happened next was not just about an old man, an empty building, or a daughter trying to save her father from himself. It was about the truth waiting behind a wall no one had touched in 50 years. 2 nights later, the town council met in the municipal basement. Frank Holloway sat in the third row, his faded postal cap in both hands. Denise sat beside him, stiff-backed and silent. She had not wanted to come. "You don't have to embarrass yourself in front of everyone," she had told him in the parking lot. Frank had only said, "I'm not here to embarrass anybody." But as soon as they entered, people turned, whispered, and gave him the pitying smile reserved for widowers doing strange things after the funeral. At the front stood Grant Whitmore, too polished for a town where men wore work boots to meetings. Behind him sat a glossy rendering of Progress Plaza, built where the old post office stood. Councilman Harold Pike cleared his throat. "We're here tonight," Pike said, "to discuss the abandoned postal property on Main Street, recently purchased by Mr. Frank Holloway." He said purchased the way a doctor might say infection. A small laugh moved through the room. Grant stepped forward. "I want to be respectful," he said. "Mr. Holloway served this town for years. But the building is unsafe, vacant for decades, roof failing, water damaged, an eyesore at the entrance to downtown." A few heads nodded. Frank stayed still. "I made Mr. Holloway a fair private offer," Grant continued. "Enough to cover his purchase price, back taxes, repair liability, and still leave him with a comfortable cushion." Denise looked down at the papers in her lap. Frank noticed. That hurt more than the laughter. Grant's voice warmed. "This is not about disrespecting the past. It's about making sure an old building doesn't become a financial trap for an elderly man and his family." The word elderly landed quietly, but hard. Someone coughed to hide a chuckle. Denise leaned toward Frank. "Please," she whispered, "just listen to him." Frank remembered when she believed he could find anything. Lost checks, misdelivered cards, packages left at the wrong farmhouse. Now she looked at him like he was the thing that had gotten lost. Councilman Pike adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Holloway, would you like to respond?" Frank stood slowly, holding the cap to his chest. Every eye measured his worn coat, old shoes, thin white hair, and grief since Martha's funeral. He walked to the microphone and looked again at Grant's drawing. No brick post office, no sorting wall, no locked room where, in 1971, Postmaster Lewis had told a 21-year-old Frank to forget the extra mailbag by the record's door. Frank had forgotten many things in 76 years. He had not forgotten that. "I delivered mail in this town for 42 years, Frank said softly. "I know the porches, the dogs, the overseas sons, the checks that had to arrive before the 5th. The room grew quieter. Grant's smile thinned. Frank looked at Pike. "And I know some letters were never delivered from that building." No one moved. Then someone laughed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Another voice said, "Dead mail doesn't make a building historic." More people laughed. Grant stepped beside him. "Mr. Holloway," he said gently, too gently. "Every post office in America had undeliverable mail. That does not mean there is some mystery hidden in the walls." Frank looked at Pike. For the first time that night, Pike looked away. Denise saw it. Frank saw it too. "There's a room behind the sorting wall," Frank said. Grant's expression changed slightly, but Frank had spent 4 decades reading faces. He knew confusion from recognition. Pike tapped the microphone. "This is getting off topic." "No," Frank said. "I think it's finally getting on topic." Denise reached for his sleeve. Not in anger this time, but fear. "Dad," she whispered. "What are you doing?" Frank wanted to tell her everything. Martha's strange questions, the county notes under their bed, and what she had said 2 weeks before she died. "Frank, if that place ever opens up, don't let them clean it out before someone reads what's inside." But he could not say that here. Not yet. Grant stepped into the aisle. "I think we all understand what's happening," he said, sharper now. "Mr. Holloway is grieving. His wife passed recently. He associates that building with a better time. And while that is sad, it should not prevent the rest of this town from moving forward." That was when Denise stood. "Don't talk about my mother," she said. The room went silent. Grant lifted both hands. "I meant no offense." But offense had already been taken. Frank looked at his daughter. For the first time in weeks, her anger was not pointed at him. Pike called for order. He proposed a safety inspection, a renovation restriction, and a follow-up hearing. It sounded procedural and clean. Frank knew what clean language could hide. By the time the meeting ended, no vote had been taken. Frank could keep the building for now. The town would not make it easy. Outside, Denise followed Frank across the parking lot. "Dad," she said, "what letters?" Frank stopped beside his truck. Across the street, the abandoned post office sat in the dark. Frank looked at it. Then he said, "Your mother asked me once what happens to a letter nobody wants delivered." Denise did not answer. For the first time, she looked at the post office not like a ruin, but like a place that had been waiting. Frank Holloway had carried mail for 42 years. But he still remembered his first morning as clearly as the day his daughter was born. He was 21 then, thin as a rail, wearing shoes his mother had polished twice, because she said a man ought to look grateful when daylight gave him work. Most boys in Benton Ridge expected to end up in the mines. Frank had expected the same. His father had spent half his life under the mountain and came home every evening with coal dust in the lines of his hands. But by the time Frank finished school, his father's back was ruined, and his mother told him, "Find a job where the sun knows your face." So Frank took the substitute carrier position at the old post office on Main Street. At first, he thought mail was just envelopes, stamps, and addresses. Then, Earl Mason, the older carrier training him, corrected that on the 3rd day. "Mail ain't paper," Earl said, handing him a bundle tied with string. "It's expectation. You carry that wrong, and somebody's whole day goes wrong with it." Frank never forgot that. He learned which widow waited every Thursday for a letter from Ohio. He learned which miner's wife stood by the screen door near the 1st of the month, pretending not to worry about whether the disability check had come. He learned which families gathered on the porch when a son wrote from overseas, and which houses went quiet when a bill arrived in a brown envelope. Some letters were light in the hand. Others felt heavy before they were opened. That was why Frank never bent photographs, never left envelopes out in the rain, and never treated a wrong address like a small thing. If a name was written on something, he believed that name deserved to be found. Years later, Martha loved him for that. She worked at the county records office when Frank first really noticed her. She was standing on a step stool, pulling down a deed book nearly too wide for her arms, muttering because someone had shelved the years out of order. Frank offered help. Martha looked over her shoulder and said, "If I needed help, Mr. Holloway, I would have asked before risking my foot." He laughed, and she almost smiled. Martha knew records the way Frank knew routes. She could spot a copied deed, a missing page, a strange transfer, or a property line that had been moved by half a sentence. After they married, Frank used to say there was not a name in Benton Ridge that could stay lost between the two of them. Martha would answer, "Names are easy. It's the truth people misfile." For years, Frank thought it was just one of her sayings. Near the end of her life, he stopped being sure. Her illness came quietly. First, she stopped working in the garden. Then she stopped going upstairs unless she had to. Then one afternoon, Frank found her at the kitchen table with old county maps spread around her. One finger resting on a family name circled 3 times in pencil. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Remembering," she said. That was all she would give him. In her final months, Martha asked about the old post office more than once. Not the newer postal counter by the highway, the original brick building on Main Street, with boarded windows and a flagpole rusted at the base. "Do you remember the records room?" she asked one night, while Frank washed 2 coffee cups at the sink. "Of course. Do you remember Postmaster Lewis keeping it locked?" Frank dried his hands slowly. Lewis had been dead for years, but the name still brought back the smell of pipe tobacco, damp paper, and floor wax. "He kept plenty of things locked," Frank said. Martha looked at him from her chair. "Not like that." She did not explain. Another time, after a doctor's appointment, they drove past the abandoned post office just as sunset burned across the plywood windows. Martha turned her head and watched it until they reached the next block. "If that place ever opens up," she said, "don't let them clean it out before someone reads what's inside." Frank glanced at her. "What's inside?" Martha closed her eyes. Maybe nothing. Maybe the reason some people never got an answer. He asked her later what she meant. She only said she had pieces, not proof. Appeal records marked late when she believed they had been mailed on time. Property claims that vanished from the county files. Old families who left town angry and poor, then disappeared from public memory as if they had never lived there at all. "Paper can bury a person cleaner than dirt," she told him once. Frank did not understand then. Or maybe he understood enough to be afraid of knowing more. After Martha died, the house felt larger and emptier. Her reading glasses stayed beside her chair for weeks. Denise came by with casseroles, medicine reminders, and the careful voice adult children use when love has turned into worry. She saw her father walking to Main Street in the rain, standing outside the old post office with one hand on the fence, and she thought grief had pulled him backward. Frank knew why she thought that. But to him, the building was not a memory trying to trap him. It was an unfinished delivery. The first time he asked about buying it, the real estate clerk laughed because she thought he was joking. The second time, she warned him about the roof. The third time, she told him plainly that the place was not worth saving. Frank paid anyway. He did not buy it because he was lonely. He did not buy it because he missed sorting Christmas cards or walking wet sidewalks before dawn. He bought it because Martha had spent her last strength circling old names on county maps, asking about a locked room, and wondering what happened to letters nobody wanted delivered. And because Frank Holloway had built his whole life on one belief: if something had a name on it, it deserved to be found, even if it had been waiting behind a wall for 50 years. That was why, the morning after the town council laughed at him, Frank unlocked the front door of the old post office, stepped into the smell of dust and wet wood, and looked toward the sorting wall. It was time to stop defending the building from the outside. It was time to find out what everyone else had missed. Frank stood inside the old post office for a long moment before he moved. The place smelled of wet wood, dust, mouse droppings, and something older underneath. A dry paper smell that had soaked into the walls long before the roof began to leak. Morning light pushed through cracks in the plywood, falling in thin gray stripes across the lobby floor. The tiles were broken. The old brass service bell was gone. The counter where people once bought stamps had warped, and the glass above it carried a long crack from one corner to the other. To anyone else, it was exactly what Grant Whitmore had called it: a liability, a hazard, a building that had outlived its purpose. Frank saw those things too. He noticed the dark stains across the ceiling, the soft places near the back wall, the way the floor dipped where rainwater had settled for years. He knew Denise was right about the money. Every sagging board had a price attached to it, but he also saw what the others did not. He saw Mrs. Wilkes mailing a birthday card to a son who never came home enough. He saw miners lined up on Friday afternoons, cashing postal money orders before walking to the grocery. He saw children pressing their faces against the glass cases during Christmas, trying to guess which packages belonged to them. He saw Martha in the doorway once, smiling because he had ink on his sleeve and did not know it. The town saw a dead building. Frank saw a room full of unfinished voices, He walked past the counter and into the old sorting area. The shelves were still there, though half the labels had peeled away. Some route numbers remained in faded pencil. Route 2, Route 4, Box 118. Names that had once meant houses, dogs, porches, and waiting hands. He touched one slot with 2 fingers. The wood was cold. Behind the sorting shelves stood the wall Martha had asked about. Frank had not been back there in decades. During his working years, carriers were told not to crowd that side unless they had business in the records room. But now, looking at it without people moving around him, Frank noticed something he should have seen years ago. The wall was too deep. Not by much. Maybe 8 inches. Maybe 10. But old buildings had a rhythm to them, and Frank had spent enough years inside this one to feel when a line did not belong. The sorting shelves sat against the plaster, but the plaster ended strangely near the back corner, as if a repair had been made and painted over without matching the rest. Frank pulled a small flashlight from his coat pocket and aimed it low. The paint near the floor was a different shade. He crouched, one knee cracking, and brushed away a line of dust. Beneath it were old nail heads, set in a neat vertical row, too even to be random. Someone had covered something. Not recently. The paint was old. The dust was older. But it had been done by a person who wanted the wall to look ordinary. Frank stood slowly. On the other side of the sorting area was the postmaster's office. The door hung half open. Inside, the desk remained, heavy oak, water-stained, one drawer swollen shut. Grant would have called it trash. Denise would have called it dangerous to touch. Frank called it evidence of a man who had left in a hurry. He tried the top drawer first. Empty. The second held mouse-chewed envelopes, a rusted letter opener, and a 1982 calendar with every month still turned to March. The bottom drawer stuck. Frank pulled until it came open with a wooden groan. Inside was a small metal cash box. His heart beat harder before he even touched it. The box was unlocked. There was no money inside, only 2 brittle rubber bands, a broken pencil, and a key wrapped in brown paper. The paper had no note, no explanation, only a faint mark where someone's thumb had darkened the fold. The key was smaller than a door key, heavier than a desk key, with a square head and old black tarnish around the teeth. Frank held it in his palm. For one foolish second, he wished Martha were there to look at it with him. She would have turned it over, studied the cut, and asked the right question before he even knew what mattered. Instead, the building creaked around him. Outside, a truck slowed on Main Street. Frank looked through the cracked office window and saw Grant Whitmore's pickup roll past. It did not stop. It did not need to. The message was plain enough. Grant was watching. Frank slipped the key into his coat pocket. Then, he went to the records closet. It stood at the rear of the building, beside the strange section of wall. The door was narrow, painted gray, with a brass plate so tarnished he could barely read the words. Records. Authorized personnel only. Frank remembered that plate polished bright. He remembered Lewis standing in front of that door in 1971, blocking the way with one arm while a canvas mailbag sat on the floor behind him. Frank had been young then, young enough to obey before he understood why obedience could become a kind of silence. He tried the knob. Locked. He took out the key from the cash box. It fit. For a moment, he stood there with the key in the lock, listening to rainwater drip into a bucket behind the counter. His hand tightened. He thought of Denise, furious and frightened. He thought of Martha telling him not to let anyone clean the place out before someone read what was inside. Frank turned the key. The lock shifted, but did not open. Something inside had jammed. He tried again, carefully. The metal held. A younger man might have forced it. Frank did not. Old things broke when rushed, and if this door had waited 50 years, it could wait one more hour. He stepped back, breathing hard, and looked again at the wall beside the closet. That was when he noticed the line near the baseboard. A seam, thin as thread, running where no seam should be. Frank bent close, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The records closet was locked, but the wall beside it was not just a wall, and whatever Martha had wanted read, Frank was beginning to understand one thing. It had not been left in the open for honest men to find. Frank returned to the post office the next morning with a toolbox, a thermos of black coffee, and a yellow legal pad Martha had once used for grocery lists. He did not come to tear anything apart. That was the first rule he wrote at the top of the page. Do not rush old wood. Below it, he made a second note. Photograph everything before moving it. Martha would have approved of that. Records mattered. Order mattered. If something had been hidden, then the way it had been hidden mattered too. He started with small things. He set buckets under the leaks. He swept broken plaster away from the sorting shelves. He cleared mouse nests from the corner near the postmaster's office and laid each object he found on the counter. A rusted stamp pad, a bent drawer pull, 3 blank money order forms, and a route card so faded only half the names remained. By mid-morning, people had started slowing down outside. Benton Ridge had always been a town where work became entertainment if the worker looked foolish enough. A pickup rolled by first, then another. Someone honked. Someone shouted, "Find any treasure yet, Frank?" He did not answer. He was kneeling beside the records closet, measuring the baseboard seam with an old carpenter's ruler, when the front door opened hard enough to rattle the cracked glass. Denise stepped inside, carrying a folder against her chest. She stopped when she saw the buckets, the exposed nails, and her father on one knee in the dust. "Dad," she said, "please tell me you are not doing this alone." Frank looked up. "I'm not taking the building down. I'm only looking. That's what worries me." She crossed the room carefully, avoiding a soft place in the floor without knowing she had done it. That was Denise. Practical, even when frightened. She opened the folder and took out estimates she had printed from the insurance office, the roofing company, and the county inspection department. "Roof repair," she said, laying down the first paper. "Electrical inspection. Structural work. Liability insurance. Temporary fencing. Mold removal. This is before anything inside can even be touched." Frank wiped dust from his hands. "I know it costs money." "No," she said, her voice cracking. "You know numbers. You are not hearing what they mean." He looked at the papers. Denise had highlighted the totals in yellow. The color made him think of Martha's cardigan in the county records office, and for a moment he had to look away. Denise softened, but only for a breath. "Mom would not want you to lose everything over a building." Frank stood slowly. "Your mother is why I'm here." Denise's face changed. Not anger this time. Pain. Before she could answer, tires crunched outside. A white truck pulled to the curb, followed by a smaller county vehicle. Grant Whitmore stepped out with 2 men in orange vests and a rolled site plan under his arm. Frank watched them through the dirty front window. Denise turned. "Did you call them?" "No." Grant entered without knocking. "Morning, Mr. Holloway," he said, as if the night before had not happened. "Denise." She stiffened at the use of her first name. Grant looked around the lobby with a practiced sigh. "This is worse than I remembered." "This is private property," Frank said. "Of course," Grant replied. "For now, we are only taking exterior measurements from the sidewalk and checking the adjacent utilities. Nothing illegal." The men in orange vests moved near the front windows, speaking quietly into radios. Frank stepped toward them. Grant raised one hand. "Easy. Nobody's touching your wall." That word made Frank stop. Wall. Grant noticed too late that he had chosen the wrong one. Denise looked between them. "What wall?" Grant smiled quickly. "Any wall. All the walls. This place is one hard rain from coming down." Frank said nothing. Grant lowered his voice, turning toward Denise more than Frank. "I know this is difficult. Grief makes people attach meaning to things. A chair, a room, an old building. But when attachment starts costing a family its future, somebody has to be brave enough to say so." Denise looked at the floor. Frank felt the words land exactly where Grant aimed them. He could take being mocked by strangers. He had carried mail through dogs, storms, drunks, and doors slammed in his face. But watching someone use Denise's worry as a lever against him made something cold settle under his ribs. Grant continued, softer now. "I can still make the offer. Better than before. Enough to protect him. Enough to protect you." That was when Frank picked up the small key from the counter. Grant's eyes moved to it, only for a second, but Frank saw. Denise saw him see. Frank closed his hand around the key. "You should leave." Grant held the smile a moment longer, then nodded to the men outside. "We'll be in touch after the safety notice." When he was gone, the building seemed quieter than before. Denise turned back to her father. "What key is that?" Frank did not answer immediately. He walked to the records closet, put the key into the lock, and tried again. The mechanism shifted inside, but the door would not open. He tried less force, then more. The old brass knob trembled but held. "Dad, stop," Denise said. "If I force it, it breaks." Frank murmured. "Then call someone, and have them tear out the frame?" She threw up one hand. "Better than you hurting yourself in here." Frank stepped back from the door, breathing harder than he wanted her to hear. Age had a way of turning small efforts into public announcements. He hated that most of all. He took his legal pad and wrote, "Lock turns, internal jam, possible obstruction." Denise watched him. For a moment, she looked less like a daughter fighting him and more like Martha used to when a document refused to explain itself. Then the bell above the front door gave a weak, broken jingle. An old woman stood in the entrance, one hand gripping the frame. She wore a blue raincoat, though the sky was clear, and her white hair was pinned neatly under a plastic scarf. Frank knew her immediately, though he had not seen her this close in years. Ruth Bell. She had worked the counter when Frank was still young enough to think orders and truth were the same thing. Her eyes moved from the buckets to the sorting shelves, then to the key in Frank's hand. All the color left her face. "Where did you get that?" she asked. Frank held it up, postmaster's desk. Ruth swallowed. Denise took a step closer to her father. "Mrs. Bell, do you know what it opens?" Ruth did not answer right away. She looked toward the records closet, then toward the wall beside it. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Frank," she said, "if that opens what I think it opens, you need somebody with you." The room went still. Even the dripping water seemed to wait. Ruth Bell would not step fully into the sorting room at first. She stood just inside the doorway, one hand still gripping the strap of her purse, her eyes fixed on the key in Frank's hand as if it were something alive. The years had made her smaller, but not vague. There was nothing confused in the way she looked at the records closet. Frank had seen that look before. It was the look of someone recognizing a sound in the dark. "Ruth," he said gently. "What do you know?" She pressed her lips together. Denise shut the front door behind her, softer this time. For once, she did not interrupt. Ruth took 3 slow steps into the room. Her shoes made tiny cracking sounds over old plaster dust. She looked at the sorting shelves, then at the wall beside the records closet, then at Frank. "Lewis didn't trust anybody near this room," she said. "Postmaster Lewis?" Denise asked. Ruth nodded. "He had rules for everything. Rules about stamps, rules about closing drawers, rules about how carriers stacked outgoing mail. But the records room was different. That wasn't a rule. That was fear." Frank felt the key grow heavier in his palm. Ruth looked toward the gray door. There were nights he stayed after closing. Not often. Maybe once every few months. A black county car would pull up out back. Never out front. Someone would come in through the rear entrance, and Lewis would take certain mailbags into this room. "What kind of mailbags?" Frank asked. Ruth looked at him. "You were young then." "That isn't an answer." "No," she said. "It's the reason I didn't give you one." The room went quiet. Ruth lowered herself onto a wooden stool near the sorting counter. Denise moved as if to help, but Ruth raised one hand. "I saw envelopes," Ruth said. "Bundles. Some addressed to county offices, some to Charleston, some to federal agencies, Housing Board, Miners Relief, Veterans Appeals. I remember because people came in asking if their letters had gone out. Widows. Men with lung trouble. Families getting pushed off land for roadwork or mine expansion." Frank remembered some of those faces, but not the pattern. At 21, he had carried what he was given, sorted what he was told, and believed the system above him was cleaner than the mud on his boots. "Did Lewis keep them?" Denise asked. Ruth's eyes grew wet. "I don't know what he kept. I know what I didn't see leave." That sentence settled over the room like dust. Frank walked to the records closet again and tried the key once more. The lock turned halfway, then caught. He stopped before the metal snapped. Ruth watched his hand. It may not open from there anymore, she said. Frank turned. What do you mean? Ruth pointed toward the wall beside the closet. Her finger trembled. There used to be a cabinet there. Tall, heavy, always locked. Lewis said it held postal forms, but nobody ever took forms from it. After he retired, the cabinet disappeared. The wall looked different after that. Frank crouched near the baseboard seam he had noticed earlier. Denise came closer. This time, she did not tell him to stop. Dad, she said quietly, what are you looking for? A lie with edges, Frank said. He took a small utility knife from his toolbox and scored the paint along the seam. Slowly, carefully. He did not pry at first. He cleared dust from the nail heads, photographed the baseboard with his old phone, then marked the measurements on Martha's yellow legal pad. Denise watched every step. You're documenting it, she said. Your mother would haunt me if I didn't. That almost made Denise smile. Almost. Frank slid the tip of a flat screwdriver beneath the thinnest part of the baseboard and lifted gently. The wood resisted. He shifted his grip, waited, and tried again. This time, the board gave a small, dry pop. Ruth flinched. Behind the board was not brick, not plaster. A narrow black gap ran behind the wall. Denise drew in a breath. Frank held the flashlight close. The beam caught dust, spider webs, and the rough edge of an inner panel that had been nailed from the outside. There's space back there, Denise whispered. Frank did not answer. His hand had begun to shake, but not from age this time. He removed one more strip of wood. A small piece of brittle paper slid out and landed near his knee. No one moved. It was not a whole envelope, only a torn corner, yellowed and soft at the fold. But there was handwriting on it. A name, part of an address, a postage mark so faded it looked like a bruise. Frank picked it up with both hands. Ruth covered her mouth. Denise leaned over his shoulder. What does it say? Frank adjusted the flashlight. The first name was nearly gone. The last name was not. Caldwell, Denise frowned. Who's Caldwell? Frank closed his eyes. He remembered a family on the north end of town. A small white house near the creek. 3 children. A mother who waited by the mailbox with her coat buttoned wrong in winter because she was always in a hurry. Then, one spring, they were gone. People said they had moved after losing their claim. People said lots of things back then. Ruth's voice came thin and low. Lena Caldwell came in every week for 2 months, asking whether her appeal had been mailed. Frank opened his eyes. Denise stared at the torn paper in his hand. Appeal for what? Ruth looked at the wall. For her house, she said. For the land they told her she had no right to keep. The building seemed to pull the air from the room. Frank placed the torn corner on the counter as if it were something sacred. It was not proof enough for a court. Not yet. It was not enough to explain 50 years of silence. Not yet. But it was enough to change the room. Enough to change Denise's face. Enough to make Ruth finally say the thing she had carried for half her life. There were more, she whispered. Frank looked back at the wall, at the dark gap behind the baseboard, and understood that the first piece had not fallen out by accident. It had been waiting closest to the edge. Like the building had chosen one name to speak first. The rain came that night, like it had been waiting for permission. It struck Benton Ridge after midnight, hard and slanted, rattling windows, filling gutters, and turning Main Street into a black ribbon of reflected streetlights. Frank woke before 2, not because of thunder, but because of the thought of the old post office roof giving way over everything still hidden inside. He sat on the edge of his bed for less than a minute. Then he put on his coat. By the time he reached Main Street, rainwater was running off the brim of his cap and down the back of his neck. The old post office looked smaller in the storm, hunched against the weather like a tired animal. A fresh stream of water poured from a broken gutter above the rear wall. Frank unlocked the door with cold fingers. Inside, the smell of wet plaster hit him at once. The bucket behind the counter had overflowed. Water spread across the floor in a thin sheet, carrying dust, paint flakes, and scraps of old insulation. Somewhere in the back, something dripped steadily, too fast to ignore. Frank moved toward the sorting room. That was when he heard a voice behind him. Dad. He turned. Denise stood in the doorway, hair damp, coat pulled tight around her. Ruth Bell was beside her, breathing hard, one hand pressed against the doorframe. Denise lifted a flashlight. Don't look at me like that. Mrs. Bell called me. Ruth gave a weak nod. Somebody needed to. Frank wanted to argue. Instead, he handed Denise the other flashlight from his toolbox. The three of them moved into the back. The wall beside the records closet was darker than before. Rain had found its way inside the plaster, swelling the old repair seam Frank had opened. The baseboard was bowed outward now, and the thin black gap behind it had widened enough for cold air to move through. Then the ceiling groaned. Denise looked up. Dad, a strip of plaster broke loose above the sorting shelves and crashed onto the floor. Frank pulled Denise back just as another section cracked open. Water poured through, striking the top of the old shelving. The whole wall shuddered. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then an envelope slid out from behind the shelves. It landed face down in the water. Frank froze. Another followed. Then 3 more. Then a whole bundle, tied with brittle twine, dropped from the opened wall and burst against the floor, scattering yellowed envelopes across the wet boards. Ruth made a sound like someone had taken the air from her chest. Denise stepped forward, then stopped, afraid to touch anything. Frank knelt slowly. He picked up the nearest envelope by its corner and turned it over. The ink had faded, but the name remained. Lena Caldwell. Below it was another, Thomas Avery. Then, one addressed to the West Virginia Housing Appeals Office. Another to the Federal Miners Relief Board. Another to the Veterans Property Claims Division. Frank's hand began to tremble, not from age, not from cold, from the terrible weight of being right. The wall gave another low crack. This time, the hidden space opened wider. More letters came loose. Dozens. Then so many that Denise dropped to her knees and began lifting them out of the water without being told. Ruth took off her raincoat and spread it on the driest part of the floor. "Put them here," Ruth said, her voice shaking. "Careful. Don't stack the wet ones too tight." The three of them worked in silence. For 10 minutes, maybe 20. The building had no past and no future. Only hands moving through old paper. Frank lifted bundles. Denise sorted dry from damp. Ruth read names under her breath as if saying them aloud might apologize for all the years no one had. Caldwell, Turner, Hobbs, Mercer, Ellison. Names Frank remembered from porches that had gone quiet. Names he had not heard in decades. Some envelopes had been opened and resealed. Some had never been opened at all. Some carried official markings. Others were written in pencil. The handwriting cramped and desperate, as if the person who wrote them had been trying to fit a whole life into one page. Denise picked up one letter and read the first lines before she could stop herself. "To whom it may concern, I am writing again because we have received no answer regarding our relocation claim." Her voice faded. Ruth opened another, hands trembling. "My husband served in Korea, and the notice said veterans would receive priority review." Frank found one, from a miner's widow. "If this appeal is late, it is not because I did not send it. I mailed the first copy from Benton Ridge Post Office on May 6. He closed his eyes. May 6th. A date could become a grave marker if no one answered it. Denise turned another envelope over. Then, she stopped. Her face changed so suddenly Frank felt it before he saw what she held. "What is it?" he asked. Denise did not answer. She stared at the handwriting on the front of the envelope. The letters were neat, slightly slanted, with a distinctive loop in the capital H. Frank knew that handwriting. He had seen it on grocery lists, birthday cards, county notes, and the label Martha had taped to every box in their attic because she believed even memories deserved order. Denise whispered, "Mom." Ruth covered her mouth. Frank took one step toward his daughter, then stopped. Denise held the envelope against her chest, as if someone might take it. It was addressed to him, Frank Holloway. Their home address beneath it. No stamp. No postmark. Just Martha's handwriting and one word written in the corner. "If." Denise looked at him with tears rising in her eyes. "She wrote to you?" Frank could barely speak. "I don't know." The envelope was sealed. For the first time since buying the building, Frank was afraid to open something. Before he could decide, headlights swept across the broken front windows. A vehicle stopped outside. Then another. Grant Whitmore stepped into the doorway a minute later, rain shining on his coat. His eyes moved from Frank to Denise to Ruth, to the letters spread across the floor. For once, he did not smile. "What happened here?" he asked. Frank stood between him and the letters. The wall opened. Grant's gaze sharpened. He saw the bundles. He saw the official addresses. He saw the old names. Then his face rearranged itself into concern. "This building is unsafe," Grant said. "You all need to leave immediately. I can have a crew secure the property tonight." "No," Denise said. Frank looked at her. So did Grant. Denise's voice shook, but she did not move back. "No one touches these letters." Grant studied her, then turned to Frank. "Mr. Holloway," he said quietly, "I'll double the offer. Right now. Cash close. No delays. You can walk away from this mess before it becomes something ugly." Frank looked down at the wet floor, the broken plaster, the names spread across Ruth's raincoat, and the sealed letter in Denise's hands. Then he looked at Grant. "It already was ugly," Frank said. "We're just seeing it now." Grant Whitmore did not leave the post office that night because Frank asked him to. He left because Denise called the sheriff. She did not shout when she did it. She did not threaten. She simply stood between Grant and the raincoat covered in old letters, took out her phone, and said, "There are historical documents here, and someone is trying to interfere with them." Grant looked at her as if she had surprised him more than the letters had. Then he stepped back into the rain. But by morning, the town knew, not the truth, only the version that moved fastest. By 9 o'clock, people were saying Frank Holloway had broken into sealed postal records. By 10, someone claimed he had found personal letters and was planning to read them aloud. By noon, the story had become uglier. Frank was exposing private family business because he could not accept that his wife was gone. Denise heard it at the pharmacy. 2 women stopped talking when she walked in. One of them looked sorry. The other looked curious. That was worse. At home, Denise found 3 missed calls from Grant and 1 from Councilman Harold Pike. Pike left a message in the calm, official tone of a man trying to sound reasonable before doing something cruel. "Denise, this situation may become legally complicated. Your father is elderly. Emotions are high. It might be wise for the family to consider whether he is capable of making decisions about that property." She played the message twice. Then she deleted it. But she did not stop hearing it. At the post office, Frank found the first notice taped to the front door. "Unsafe structure. No further entry pending inspection." The paper had been printed that morning. The tape was still clean. Ruth Bell stood beside him, wrapped in the same blue raincoat from the night before. She looked smaller in daylight. "They moved fast," she said. Frank read the notice without expression. People move fast when they are afraid of old paper. Denise arrived a few minutes later, carrying plastic storage bins, gloves, and a stack of towels. She saw the notice and stopped. "Dad," she said, "if you go in after this, they can say you violated an order." Frank looked at the boarded windows. "They can say plenty. That does not mean we hand them the chance." Her voice was sharp, but it was different now. Not the sharpness of a daughter ashamed of him. The sharpness of someone trying to keep him from walking into a trap. Frank understood the difference. So they did not go through the front. Ruth led them to the rear entrance, the one Lewis had used decades earlier when the Black County car came after closing. The door was swollen, but not locked. Frank photographed the notice first, photographed the rear door, photographed the water damage, the wall, the fallen plaster, and every bundle of letters before anyone touched them. Martha would have insisted. Inside, the letters had dried badly overnight. Some curled at the edges, some stuck together. Denise set up a careful system on the old counter. Dry envelopes in one bin, damp ones on towels. Official mail separated from personal letters. Names written on a legal pad only when readable. Frank watched her work for a moment. The same daughter who had begged him to sell the building was now handling the dead letters like they might bruise. Ruth sat near the sorting shelves, reading return addresses through a magnifying glass. "Housing Appeals Office," she whispered. "Veterans Claims, Mine Compensation Board, County Relocation Review." Again and again, the same kinds of words appeared. Appeal, notice, claim, response requested, second request, final request. Frank felt something cold gather behind his ribs. This was not Lost mail. Lost mail wandered. This had been held. Denise lifted an envelope with a torn side. "This one says mailed before deadline," she said. "But the claim was marked late?" Ruth nodded. That is what Martha was looking at. Denise went still at her mother's name. The sealed letter from Martha sat in a clean plastic sleeve beside the register. Denise had not opened it. Frank had not asked her to. Neither of them was ready for whatever Martha had left there. Not yet. Frank moved toward the postmaster's office. "There may be logs," he said. Ruth looked up too quickly. "What kind of logs?" "Mailbag transfers, closing records, anything Lewis kept because he thought no one would look twice." The bottom drawer of the desk was empty now, except for dust and the shape where the cash box had been. But behind the desk, half hidden under fallen ceiling board, Frank saw the corner of a black ledger. He pulled it free. The cover cracked when he opened it. Inside were columns written in blue ink. Date, carrier, bag number, received, transferred. For several minutes, no one spoke. Frank turned pages carefully. The years moved backward under his fingers. 1973, 1972, 1971. Then he stopped. May 6th, the same date from the miner's widow's letter. His own name was there. F. Holloway. Beside it was a bag number. And in the final column, under transferred, were the initials H.P. Denise leaned over his shoulder. "H.P.," she said. Frank did not answer. Ruth did. "Harold Pike's father was Henry Pike," she whispered. "He was on the county relocation committee." The room seemed to tilt. Frank stared at his own signature. He was 21 again, standing under fluorescent lights, taking instructions from men who sounded certain. He remembered canvas bags, rubber stamps, Lewis's pipe smoke, and the easy obedience of a young man grateful for steady work. He had signed. He had not asked. He had carried the bag to the records room because Postmaster Lewis told him to. He had gone home that evening thinking he had done his job. Frank closed the ledger slowly. Denise touched his arm. "Dad, you didn't know." He looked at the dead letters spread across the towels. "That may be true," he said. "But not knowing didn't deliver them." Ruth bowed her head. Outside, another truck slowed past the front windows. Then another. The town was watching again. Only this time, Frank no longer felt like an old man defending a building. He felt like a witness standing in a room full of people who had waited 50 years for someone to admit they had been there. Denise picked up the plastic sleeve containing Martha's sealed letter. "Then we need to know what Mom found," she said. Frank looked at the envelope, at Martha's handwriting, at the single word in the corner. If. He was not ready, but the town had already started moving against them. And some truths did not wait until a man felt strong enough to face them. Frank nodded once. "First," he said, "we match every name we can." He placed the ledger beside the letters. "Then we find out who made sure those answers never came." They worked through the afternoon with the front lights off and the back room lit by 2 flashlights, 1 desk lamp, and the thin gray daylight leaking through the boarded windows. Frank, Denise, and Ruth did not read every letter all the way through. They could not. Not yet. Some were too damaged. Some were too personal. Some deserved to be opened first by the families whose names were written across them. So they did what Martha would have done. They made a record. Name, date, destination, type of claim, condition of envelope, ledger reference. Denise wrote while Frank read. Ruth checked old names against memory, correcting spellings, connecting family names to houses that no longer stood, roads that had been renamed, and properties now owned by people who never mentioned how they got them. By the time Denise reached the 4th page of notes, the pattern was no longer something they suspected. It was something staring back at them. The letters clustered around the same 2 years. 1969 and 1970. Most were connected to the Benton Ridge Relocation Program, a county-backed project created when the state approved road expansion and mine access routes north of town. Families living near the creek, the old company road, and the lower ridge were told they would receive review, compensation, or assistance if they filed in time. The dead letters proved many of them had filed. They had asked for hearings. They had asked for extensions. They had sent proof of ownership, military service, medical hardship, widow status, and long-term residence. But in the county records, those same families had been marked as late, non-responsive, incomplete, or voluntarily withdrawn. Denise stopped writing. "That means they didn't lose because they failed to answer," she said. Frank looked down at the ledger. "No," he said. "They lost because somebody made sure their answers never arrived." Ruth closed her eyes. The ledger showed mailbags received at the post office, then transferred after hours. The initials appeared again and again beside the most important dates. A.T. A.T. Henry Pike, Councilman Harold Pike's father. But Henry Pike had not acted alone. Martha's old county notes, folded inside a file Frank found beneath the ledger, showed property transfers within months of the rejected claims. Parcels once owned by the Caldwell, Turner, Hobbs, Mercer, and Ellison families had been sold at low county auction prices. The buyers were not strangers. Pike Holdings, Whitmore Development Trust, Benton Ridge Improvement Partnership. Names that sounded clean enough to print on legal paper. Names that hid fathers, uncles, partners, and friends. Denise whispered Grant's name before Frank did. Whitmore. Ruth nodded once. Grant's grandfather was part of the first partnership. Frank looked toward the front windows, as if Grant might be standing outside again, waiting for the building to forget what it had just remembered. The truth was worse than greed. Greed would have been simpler. This was paperwork turned into a weapon. It was poverty punished for trusting procedure. It was widows, minors, veterans, and families with no lawyer being told they missed deadlines they had tried desperately to meet. And the post office, Frank's post office, had been used as the place where their voices stopped. Postmaster Lewis's role became clear in pieces. He received the mailbags. He separated the appeals. He marked some as undeliverable or delayed. Then, he transferred them after hours to Henry Pike or someone acting for the relocation committee. Maybe Lewis had been paid. Maybe threatened. Maybe he told himself he was only following county instructions. But the wall behind the sorting room told the part no excuse could soften. Someone had hidden what could not safely be destroyed. Not thrown away. Not burned. Hidden. As if even the guilty were afraid of what paper might say if fire failed to eat it all. Frank sat down in the postmaster's chair. For a moment, he could not feel his hands. His signature was in the ledger on the 6th of May, 1970. He had carried at least one of those bags. He had been young. He had not known. But innocence did not make him feel clean. Denise stood beside him with Martha's sealed letter in both hands. "We have to open it," she said. Frank looked at the envelope. The word in the corner seemed larger now. If you find this, if I am gone, if the room opens, if the truth still matters." He nodded. Denise handed it to him. Frank opened it slowly, careful not to tear the handwriting. Inside was one folded sheet, written in Martha's neat, slanted script. He read silently at first, then his breath caught, and Denise touched his shoulder. "Read it," she whispered. So he did. Not all of it. Only the parts that could fit into a room already heavy with the dead. "Frank," he read, his voice thin. "If you are reading this, then the old building finally gave up what I could not prove in time." He stopped. Ruth bowed her head. Frank forced himself to continue. "I spent years thinking some records were simply missing. Then I began seeing the same names in the wrong places. Families marked late when I remembered their wives standing in line at the post office. Veterans denied review after telling everyone they mailed their forms. Widows whose land changed hands before their appeals could have been answered." Denise wiped her face with the back of her hand. Frank read on. "I never had enough to accuse anyone. Only copies, dates, and the feeling that Benton Ridge had been cleaned with dirty hands. If the letters are there, do not let them disappear again. Do not protect my memory by hiding the truth. I married you because you believed names should reach the people they belonged to. This is no different." Frank's voice broke on the next line. "Even if one of those names is yours." The room went still. Denise looked at him. Frank lowered the letter. There it was. Martha had known. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know that Frank might find his own signature in the chain. Enough to know he would be tempted to protect himself by calling ignorance innocence. He read the final lines to himself first. Then, aloud, "If you carried something without knowing what it was, that is sorrow. If you find out and still stay silent, that becomes a choice." Frank closed his eyes. For 42 years, he had believed the job was simple. Carry what was given, deliver what was addressed, trust the system to be honest above him. But the system had not been honest. And trust, once used by dishonest men, could become a tool in their hands. Denise knelt beside him. "You were 21, she said. "You didn't know." Frank looked at the letters spread across the counter. Lena Caldwell had known enough to write twice. A veteran had known enough to send proof. A miner's widow had known enough to write the date she mailed her appeal. Martha had known enough to keep searching while she was dying. Not knowing might explain Frank's past. It could not decide his present. He folded Martha's letter along the same creases she had made. Then he placed it beside the ledger. "We make copies," he said. "Every page we can safely handle. We call the state archive. We call a lawyer who does not owe Pike or Whitmore a favor. And then we call the families." Ruth looked afraid. Denise did too. Frank was afraid with them. Outside, a car slowed in front of the post office. This time, no one moved toward the window. Frank rested his hand on the ledger, then on Martha's letter. "For 50 years, he said. This town has been living on answers that never arrived." He stood slowly. "Now we deliver them." The second town hall meeting was not held in the basement. There were too many people for that. By 7 o'clock, the high school gym was full of folding chairs, winter coats, whispered names, and the uneasy silence of a town that had learned too late it was standing on someone else's unanswered prayers. Frank Holloway sat in the front row, with Denise on one side and Ruth Bell on the other. On the table before them were 3 archival boxes from the county library. Inside were the dead letters, dried as carefully as possible, each one placed in a sleeve, numbered, and copied twice. Frank had wanted to stand alone. Denise would not allow it. When Councilman Harold Pike walked in, the room did not boo. That would have been easier. Instead, people simply turned and looked at him. Pike removed his coat slowly and sat near the aisle, his face pale under the gym lights. Grant Whitmore came in 5 minutes later and stood in the back. No polished speech, no developer smile. Just a man realizing some properties came with ghosts no bulldozer could clear. The county clerk opened the meeting, but her voice shook too badly to continue. So, Denise stood. "My father did not buy the old post office to hurt this town," she said. "He bought it because my mother believed something inside had been hidden from the people who needed it most." She lifted Martha's letter. "This is from Martha Holloway. My mother. She found patterns in county records before she died, but she did not have the letters. Now we do." The gym went still. Denise did not read every word. She read only enough. Families marked late when their letters had been mailed. Claims denied because answers never arrived. Names removed from files, then from land, then from memory. When she finished, Frank stood. Walking to that microphone felt harder than any root of his life. "I signed one of the ledgers," he said. A murmur moved through the room. Frank did not hide from it. "I was 21. I did not know what the bag held. I did not know where it was going, but my name is there. And if I ask this town to face the truth, I have to start with the part of it that touches me." Denise looked down, crying silently. "I am sorry," Frank said. "Not because I meant harm. I didn't. But because harm can pass through honest hands when honest hands never ask enough questions." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then an old woman in the third row stood with help from her grandson. "My mother was Lena Caldwell," she said. Frank's face changed. "She died thinking nobody cared enough to answer her. She used to say she mailed everything they asked for. People told her she was confused." Ruth covered her mouth. Denise reached into the first archival box and found the sleeve marked Caldwell, Lena. She carried it to the woman herself. No speech, no ceremony, just a daughter receiving proof that her mother had not imagined her own ruin. After that, others stood. A miner's son, a veteran's niece, a man whose grandparents had left Benton Ridge in 1971 and never returned. Each received a copy, not the original. The originals would go to the state archive for preservation. Frank had insisted on that. Truth deserved both a home and a chain of custody. Councilman Pike stood last. He looked older than he had a week before. "My father's initials appear in the transfer ledger," he said. "I cannot defend that. I will not try." Someone muttered, "Convenient." Now that he's dead, Pike accepted it. "Yes," he said, "it is convenient. Too convenient. And that is why I will support an independent review, release all relocation committee records still held by the town, and recuse myself from any vote involving the post office property." It was not enough. Everyone knew that. But it was the first time a Pike had said anything in that room without hiding behind procedure. Grant Whitmore stepped forward after him. "My family trust purchased land connected to those transfers," he said. "I did not create that history, but I benefited from what it became." He looked at Frank. "The development offer is withdrawn. I will contribute to the preservation fund and to legal review for the affected families." Frank watched him carefully. Money was easy for men like Grant. Public admission was harder. Ruth Bell rose with Denise's help. "I saw enough to wonder," she said, "and I stayed quiet because I was afraid of losing my job." Her voice broke. "I have been sorry for 50 years. I know sorry does not deliver a letter. But I am here now, and I will help identify every name I can." That was when the room finally changed. Not healed, not forgiven, changed. The old post office was no longer just Frank's stubborn purchase. It was evidence. It was memory. It was the place where the town had failed, and maybe the only place where it could begin to answer. By the end of the meeting, they formed a volunteer committee. Denise for cataloging, Ruth for names and roots, the county librarian for preservation, 2 descendants for family contact, and Frank for delivery. Not mail delivery this time. Truth delivery. As people left, the Caldwell woman stopped beside Frank. "My mother waited her whole life for an answer," she said. Frank lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry it came so late." She touched his sleeve. "Late is not the same as never." Frank watched her walk away with the copy held against her chest. There was still work ahead. Lawyers. Records. Anger. Questions nobody living could fully answer. But the letters had spoken in public, and no one in Benton Ridge could pretend the old post office was empty anymore. 6 months later, the old post office opened again. Not as a convenience store, not as a polished museum with shiny plaques and expensive lighting. It opened quietly, on a Saturday morning in early spring, with the front steps scrubbed clean, the brick patched where the rain had eaten through the mortar, and a simple wooden sign beside the door. Benton Ridge, Community Letter Room. The flagpole still leaned a little. The floor still creaked near the old service counter. The building had not been made young again, and Frank was glad of that. Some places did not need to pretend time had not touched them. They only needed to be strong enough to hold what time had left behind. Inside, the sorting wall remained. A carpenter had reinforced it, but no one had covered the opening where the letters had been found. Instead, a sheet of protective glass stood over that section, showing the narrow, hidden space behind the wall. Visitors could see the boards, the old nails, the dark gap, and the place where silence had lived for 50 years. Denise had insisted on that. "People should see how ordinary it looked," she told Frank. "That's the frightening part." She spent Saturdays at the long table near the front windows, wearing cotton gloves and reading names aloud with the county librarian. She no longer rushed through old paper like it was clutter. She handled it the way Martha once had, carefully, patiently, as if every crease might explain someone's life. Ruth Bell sat beside her most mornings. Age tired Ruth quickly, but memory still served her in flashes. A return address would appear, and she would close her eyes. "That was near the creek road," she would say. "Blue porch. 2 boys. Their father walked with a limp." Or, she always mailed letters on Thursdays. Said Thursday gave the government 1 day to read before the weekend. Piece by piece, the town began to remember people it had trained itself to forget. Not every family could be found. Not every wrong could be repaired. Some descendants wanted copies and nothing more. Some wanted legal review. Some came angry and left angrier. Others stood in front of the glass case and cried without saying a word. Frank learned not to expect clean endings. Mail was like that too. Some letters brought checks. Some brought apologies. Some brought news no one was ready to hear. The carrier's job was never to decide whether the message was pleasant, only to deliver it. One afternoon, a boy of about 10 came in with his grandmother. The boy wore a baseball cap too large for his head and carried a school notebook under one arm. His grandmother led him to a framed envelope with the name Mercer written across it. "That was your great-grandfather," she said. The boy leaned closer. "He wrote that?" "Yes." "Did he get an answer?" His grandmother was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "But we did." Frank heard her from across the room. He looked down at the old postal cap resting in his hands. For most of his life, he had thought delivery meant getting something there on time. Now he understood that sometimes delivery meant carrying the truth across years, even when the person who needed it first was gone. Denise found him later by the sorting wall. "You okay?" she asked. Frank smiled faintly. "At my age, that question has a lot of answers." She stood beside him, looking through the glass at the hidden space. "I used to think you bought this place because you couldn't let Mom go," she said. Frank did not answer. Denise wiped one small circle of dust from the glass with her sleeve. "I think I was wrong." He looked at her then. She kept her eyes on the wall. "You bought it because she left you something to finish." Frank swallowed. "And because I was too stubborn to know when a building was worthless." Denise shook her head. "No," she said. "Because you knew when it wasn't." For a while, neither of them spoke. Outside, Main Street moved slowly through an ordinary morning. A truck passed. Someone pushed a stroller. Two old men argued about coffee on the sidewalk. The town had not become perfect. No town did. But it had become less certain of its own innocence. And that was a beginning. The development sign across the street had come down in January. In its place, someone had planted 3 young dogwood trees. Frank never asked who. Near closing time, Denise unlocked the small display case behind the counter. Inside lay Martha's letter, the original, now preserved between archival sheets. Beside it sat the black ledger, open to the page with Frank's name, and one empty space Denise had left on purpose. Frank reached into his coat pocket. He took out his old postal cap. The navy blue had faded almost gray. The brim was soft from years of rain and sun. He held it for a moment, thumb resting along the worn edge. Then he placed it in the empty space. Denise looked at him. "You sure?" Frank nodded. "I don't carry the route anymore." He closed the case gently. For years, Benton Ridge had walked past the old post office and seen nothing but rot, debt, and a building waiting to fall. But the building had not been empty. It had been full of names, full of proof, full of voices folded into envelopes, waiting for one old mailman to remember that a letter with a name on it still deserved to be found. Frank turned off the front lights, but left one lamp glowing near the sorting wall. Then he stepped outside with Denise and locked the door behind them. The old post office had been called empty once. Frank never corrected them. He just waited long enough for the letters to speak.